Agora began with a sense, about 5.5 years ago, to borrow a phrasing from one of our past lecturers, the Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, that there was a need to engage in society building, that the companionship of our common life was in rather short supply, and had been replaced instead with fragmenting, non-communicating systems of belief in which reasoned argument seemed all but impossible. At such a time, says Rabbi Sacks, there was an urgent political task to strengthen culture-creating institutions and to renew the concept of the common good. Now, I suspect that many of us in the room would agree that our political society, to put it mildly, seems broken, that it feels fragmented, that it doesn't seem to be working very well. At the same time, though, in addition to our political institutions, civil society, that lovely space in between the individual and the state, where the best and brightest things of our human existence occur, love, marriage, church, that space, that it's also under some pressure, that it has in fact perhaps lost some of its graciousness, and it's on that graciousness that so much depends. At the same time, for many, religious institutions seem unsure of themselves, not quite clear which direction to go, not sure how to deal with the contemporary world. And the contemporary university, for those who are interested in such things, has unfortunately largely abandoned its primary task of handing on culture and sound judgment. As a result, our society is trying to survive on some pretty thin gruel. The meat's not very thick. Now, even though, to use the language of Gerard Manley Hopkins, the cultural soil is bare now, nature is never spent, and there lies the dearest freshness deep down things, if we're willing to patiently till and turn the cultural soil. Another of our lecturers from this year, the amazing Mako Fujimura, if you attended, you may recall, reminded us of the task of culture care, and that those of us, and he hopes that's all of us, engaged in the task of culture care, have to think of our work as work in the garden of culture. And we have to remind ourselves that even in the apparent starkness of winter, the soil is repairing itself and replenishing itself to support the bursting array of spring, if we work. So at Agora, we engage neither in cultural polemics nor in capitulation to the times. Instead, we engage in faithful presence, the ministry of accompanying the world, while remaining entirely and unapologetically ourselves, people of faith, people of hope, and people of charity. Culture care, like gardening, as you know, is a lot of work. I have children just for that reason. And in these 4 years, our little community has been hard at work. These public lectures have now drawn thousands of participants, with many thousands more viewing them online. We've pulled together into companionship Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, Jews, Muslims, non-believers. We've had religious leaders like Rabbi Sacks and Archbishop Shepu. We've had cultural leaders like Fujimura, Jane Golden, and Chris Satullo. Scholars, artists, economists, parents, attorneys, pastors, social scientists, all pulling together to come to an understanding with each other so that we can in fact speak, reason, and breathe together. I love this notion of breathing together, to conspire, to breathe together. And so the Agora is a little conspiracy to build the good in common. Now, for a small community, there's not many of us, we've produced a remarkable amount of academic research as well. Conferences, working groups, 5 books with more on the way, dozens of articles and essays, many dozens of talks, ranging from the most hallowed halls of the academy to the dark and sweaty confines of church basements. We've produced research on marriage, parenting, education, leadership, politics, God, death, sex, and freedom. We're actually pretty exciting. There's been reading groups, seminars, discussion sessions, debates. We're hard at it. And if you know us, you know that our first love is for our students, our fellows. And if you meet them, you'll love them too, and you'll understand our exuberant and sometimes parental pride. And for Ben and John and Alicia and Thomas and Monica and Jake and Jossie and Maddie, all of whom are set to graduate in just a few short weeks, we'll miss you, and we're eager to learn of your exploits, successes, heartbreaks, and the gift that you will be to this world. And for the other fellows remaining, there's miles to go before you sleep. With our students, we've read political theory, economics, literature, Jewish philosophy, the Founding Fathers, dissident literature, and more. We've introduced them to pastors, CEOs, bankers, novelists, professors, even parents. We've placed them in internships and graduate programs. They'll spend summers at Yale. They'll be populating classical schools in the Southwest. And all to enlarge our imaginations and to enlighten the pathways of the world. And all to contribute to the common good, to labor and to build it together and with others, for no one builds the common good alone. As people of faith, we offer ourselves to the world as fellow builders, as co-laborers in the cultural garden. And so we accompany the world, faithful presence. At times, people of faith forget to accompany and rather try to rule the world, which of course overlooks the proper autonomy due to the goodness of the world. But perhaps more often now, people of faith instead capitulate to the world, to the spirit of the age. And they often do so by accepting the demands of a false secularism which insists that we enter into the public square naked, leaving behind our religious commitments, leaving behind those aspects of us which are most vital to our being. But that's hardly to be secular, it's actually to be anti-religious. It means we have to lose ourselves. And what does it profit if we gain the whole world but lose ourselves? So at Agora, we politely decline to play by those rules. Instead, we offer, without apology and without any belligerence, the presence of our full selves. And we build the common good together as full and real people, with all of our beliefs and virtues and practices in tow. We offer all of ourselves to the world. Now, some might call this little enterprise that we're doing, the Benedict option, or at least a modified version thereof. And it's one of the reasons I'm just so delighted to have Rod Dreher join us this evening to talk about his new book on Dante and how that can save your life. I first learned of his work years ago when a friend of mine gave me a copy of the really delightful book Crunchy Cons, which helped me explain myself to myself. And it also explained why I had such an odd group of friends. No offense to any of my friends here this evening, other friends. But since then, I've followed his writing fairly carefully and closely, including his moving and compelling accounts of family and place. And I've been particularly interested in the last year and a half or so on his reflections of religion in contemporary life. In fact, I think he's emerged as one of the leading proponents and arguably the most culturally aware and in-tuned expositor of the Benedict option. Now, if that's an unfamiliar phrase to you, here's Dreher's own words of what the Benedict option is. The Benedict option, he says, has to do with the final paragraph of Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue, which if you know the paragraph, it's quite memorable. MacIntyre says, "The barbarians are not at the gates. They've been ruling us for quite some time now." And MacIntyre continues that we are waiting for another, albeit very different, Benedict. So the Benedict option is waiting for St. Benedict to do what? Well, again, back to Dreher. He says, I'm not talking about everybody running for the hills and living in an armed compound. That's some of my other friends not here. But I am talking about forming communities within which we can make meaningful withdrawals from an increasingly hostile, increasingly chaotic society. Withdrawals in the sense of stepping back, not drawing upon some of the deformed cultural resources. The idea, he continues, is to be able to hold on to our knowledge and our tradition in a dark time. Now, in part, that's what we're doing. We're forming little platoons, little societies, little bands of companions in which to pass on the knowledge and traditions of our way of life. We just simply cannot offer ourselves to the world if we have no selves to offer. And the church in the West have been spending their spiritual and cultural capital for a long time now and not thinking about putting deposits back in. And if we don't put deposits back in, we'll have nothing to offer. And so at Agora and the Templeton Honors College, that's what we're doing. We're making cultural deposits, to use one metaphor, or we're turning soil left fallow for too long, to use another metaphor, so that we have something of value to offer to a waiting and watching world. Now, in his work, illuminating and engaging, funny and profound, Rod has thought through these sorts of things, and his magnanimous voice is only becoming clearer and wiser. We're going to hear a lot from Rod Dreher in the next few years, I wager. And I'm grateful for his voice. I'm grateful for what it means in terms of offering guidance, support, and good cheer to little enterprises like our own. And I'm grateful for his presence here tonight. Would you join me in welcoming him?
It's really good to be back in Philly tonight. As most of you know, I lived here from 2010 to the end of 2011. It's been a long time since I've heard anybody say water. And I have not yet visited a Wawa, but we must have the ritual pilgrimage before I leave town. I was a little bit shaky when RJ brought up the naked public square. I said, how did he know about that? The last time I was naked in the public square was Mardi Gras in 1987. The New Orleans police are very generous, charitable people. I'm thankful to them for their graciousness. I come to you tonight to talk about Dante, but I don't come as a scholar or a religious leader or any of these distinguished personages that RJ was just talking about. I'm not a scholar, and I'm not even a serious reader of fiction, let alone poetry. I'm a fat magazine journalist with bad hair from South Louisiana who likes to eat crawfish, and drink beer, and read nonfiction books. History, politics, religion, not fiction. As such, I am one of the unlikeliest advocates for medieval poetry that you could ever hope to meet. But I come to you tonight not as a scholar, but as a witness. I come to tell you about the great things that God has done for me through beauty, through art, specifically through the poetry of Dante Alighieri. Put simply, Dante saved my life. And the way that he saved my life tells us something important about our life together and how we ought to live it. Dante's Divine Comedy, a three-part poem consisting of the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso, is the story of a lost soul finding himself in a fantastical journey through the afterlife. On the sojourn, the pilgrim Dante learns how he lost the straight path through life and fell into a dark wood. He learns how to find his way out of the shadowy thicket and back to the straight path. And he learns what life looks like for those who walk in the light. Dante's is a journey of individual healing and restoration, but it is also a profound diagnosis of the sources of disorder in society, whether we're talking about the broader world, a nation, a city, a neighborhood, even a family. Now, the poet Dante Alighieri came from a world of violence, corruption, and chaos. He was born in the year 1265 in the city of Florence, which was one of the richest and most powerful in Europe in its era, but it was one racked by civil strife between two opposing political factions, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Dante rose quickly to become one of the most famous young poets of his time. Eventually, he went into politics and was elected as one of the 6 governors of Florence. He tried to be a just man and keep the peace between the factions, but he got caught up in political intrigue and was betrayed by his own political allies. Even the Pope was involved in Dante's ouster. The new rulers of Florence stripped Dante of his position and wealth and sent him into exile. They told him, if you come back, we'll kill you. And he knew they meant it. Dante had done everything right. He was on top of the world when he was exiled from the city, but his fall was swift and terrible. He was 37 years old at the time of his exile. He spent the rest of his life wandering throughout Italy, depending on the kindness of others. He contemplated on his sojourn throughout Italy in exile why this disaster had befallen him and what he should learn from it. The result is this magnificent poem, 14,233 lines of verse exploring the nature of God, of man, of love and war, and the meaning of life. All of life is in the Commedia. The Commedia is what they call it in Italian. It's one of the cornerstones of Western civilization. No less an authority than T.S. Eliot said that Dante and Shakespeare divide the world between them. There is no third, he said. I had always heard of the Commedia, certainly the Inferno, most people have, but I had never read it. It stood in my imagination like Mount Everest, something to be admired, maybe even to be a little bit afraid of, but never something to be scaled by an amateur like me. It was far too intimidating. But then I myself fell into a kind of exile. This happened when I left Philadelphia at the end of 2011 to move back to my hometown of St. Francisville, Louisiana, following the death of my sister Ruthie. Ruthie and I had been raised in the country in a little wide spot in the road called Star Hill, a suburb of St. Francisville. We now have a red light. I'm serious. We've been raised in the country by a loving father and mother. My dad was such a country boy, a big Southern patriarch, self-made man, very proud, and with a lot to be proud of. But I was not something he was proud of, because he loved me. I was his only son and his namesake. But I did not like athletics. I did not like hunting. I did not like all the country boy things that he loved. I liked books. I always had my head in a book and wanted to go to the city where other people were who liked books, I thought. My sister was the son that my father never had. She loved hunting with him. She loved sports, and she was good at it. She loved being in the country. She was born to live there. So I was bullied in high school there, as a lot of nerdy kids are in a small town. And my dad and I argued a lot when I was a teenager. I finally got away to go to a boarding school when I was 16 and never looked back. I mean, I maintain, I don't want to give a false impression that I was completely estranged from my family. I wasn't, but it was easier for us all if I was living away. In 1992, 2 years after college, I left for the East Coast in a journalism career, and that was the end of that. I thought I would like to go back home one day and live around the family, because family meant a lot to me. We were raised in a very close family. But I knew I really couldn't do that with my dad because he was so strong-willed, and I just didn't fit in a small southern town. My sister Ruthie, on the other hand, she went to LSU, as I did, and she moved back after graduation, married her high school sweetheart, and taught school in our local public schools. She taught 6th grade and then 7th and 8th grade. She had a very happy life there. She started her family there. They built a house right across a little gravel road from my mom and dad. I started my family away in New York City. And we thought that was how things were going to be. Then, right after we moved to Philadelphia in 2010, I took a job at the Templeton Foundation. My sister was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. She was 40 years old, had never smoked a day in her life. By the time they found it, it was too late. She lived for 19 months, and over the course of those 19 months, I was watching it mostly happen from up here in Philly. I saw the most amazing thing. I knew my sister was a very loving, kind, virtuous woman, but I didn't know how brave she was until I saw how she fought cancer. And the way the whole community, this community that I had turned my back on because I thought there was no place for me there, I saw how they loved my sister and loved my family through that crisis. And my wife and I, when we flew down for the funeral, we realized we had been watching for all this time this amazing outpouring of love down there. We said, you know what, we need to be part of that. We need to go back there and help my brother-in-law, Mike, raise his 3 girls that Ruthie left behind. We need to help my mom and dad. We need to be part of this community and let them help us be the kind of people that we need to be. So we said goodbye to our friends here and went down there just before Christmas of 2011. And I got a deal to write a book about my sister's life and her death and the meaning of community and what I discovered when I had this epiphany and my own heart was converted by the love we saw there in the community. And I wrote most of the book, and it was a classic Hollywood happy ending book until the last chapter. I took my niece Hannah, my sister's oldest daughter, she was 19. I took her to Paris for Easter that year, 5 months after her mother had died, 5 or 6 months, because she was taking it really hard. And I'd always promised her when she was little, Uncle Rod will take you to Paris, 'cause I love Paris, and I taught her to love Paris. Well, finally I had the money to do it. I took her to Paris. And I taught her on this trip, because she had been running away from her mother's cancer for so long. I said, Hannah, you can't run from pain. It's always better to live in the truth, no matter how painful, than it is to live a comforting lie. And I think now you know this. She said, well, Uncle Rod, I need to tell you something. I don't think that my sisters are going to accept you and Aunt Julie. I said, why is that? She said, because our mom and our grandfather, my dad, raised us to think badly of you because you moved to the city. You know, I got above myself. I was absolutely devastated. I remember exactly where I was standing on the Boulevard Saint-Germain when she told me that. I felt the earth open up and I wanted it to swallow me. I felt like it had all been a sham, that I'd moved my family from Philly and our happy life here to go down there and we weren't going to be received. Hannah immediately started crying and said, I shouldn't have told you that. I said, no, I meant what I said. It's better to live in the truth than to live a comforting lie. But I had to go back home now and finish this book, and more than that, figure out how to live there in a place where they didn't want us. And I ended the book, I told the truth about what happened, but there were signs of hope that things might work out, that my nieces, their hearts might open to us, and my mom and dad would be more accepting of us. And that's where the book ended. Well, it turns out that did not happen. I fell myself into a kind of, I realized I was exiled. I'd come 1,500 miles for them, but they wouldn't move an inch for us, because it's like the prodigal son story if the father had sided with the resentful older brother. Well, I became physically ill. I became depressed, physically ill. I was diagnosed with chronic mononucleosis, which a rheumatologist tested me and said, there's only one explanation for this. You're deeply, deeply stressed. What do you have to be stressed over? And I told him. I mean, I was sleeping 5-6 hours a day. I didn't want to leave the house, and it was all because of my family situation. Well, the doctor said, you're going to have to leave Louisiana, or you're going to destroy your health. I said, I can't leave Louisiana. This is, I've moved my wife and kids too many times in my life, and my mom and dad are here. We don't get along as well as I wish we did, but I can't leave them. I'm the only one left. He said, well, you better find inner peace some kind of way. Well, my wife, Julie, he tells me what to do. She told me, she said, listen, you need to start seeing a therapist. I said, I don't want one of these Dr. Phil types. I don't need that. She said, listen, you don't get out of bed till the middle of the afternoon. We need our dad back. Our kids need our dad back. I need my husband back. Humble yourself. Go see this guy. Well, my back was against the wall. I didn't know what else to do. I went to see him. My Orthodox priest, Father Matthew, at this time gave me a very demanding prayer discipline. He had me saying the Jesus prayer on my prayer rope for an hour a day of contemplative prayer. This was excruciating because I'm the guy who always needs stimulation. I always have to be reading something. I walk across the house with a book in my hand. But I had to be still and go into my heart, get out of my head and go into my heart. That was part of my therapy. But the most important thing that happened to me was the day I walked into a Barnes & Noble bookstore in Baton Rouge, killing time one summer afternoon, found myself in the poetry section. Why? Only God knows, and I mean that. And there on the shelf was the Divine Comedy. And I thought, I've always wanted to read that, but no way I can do that. My time is over. I should have gotten to it in college. But for whatever reason, I felt the impulse to take it off the shelf and open it up. And there are the first lines. In the middle of the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for I had lost the straight path. I thought, that sounds like me. So I read on, and Dante the Pilgrim, that is the character Dante in the poem by Dante, he's lost in the forest at night. He tries to escape, but his path is blocked everywhere he turns by wild animals. These represent his sins. He cannot leave this terrifying place under his own power. Nothing he does is working. I'm thinking, yep, I know that feeling. Suddenly, a figure appears in the mist. It's the shade of Virgil, the great poet of antiquity. And Virgil has been sent by God to lead Dante to safety. Virgil says it's going to be a long, hard walk, and he's going to see some terrible things. but there's no other way out. Now, the pilgrim Dante isn't sure he wants to do this, but what choice does he have? If he stays there, he dies. He knows Virgil is trustworthy, so he makes a leap of faith and starts walking. So I closed this book and I thought, this is a poem about midlife crisis. This is a poem about a man like me who doesn't know what's happened to him, doesn't know how to get out of here. And I should say my rheumatologist said that somebody who has chronic mononucleosis is 100 times more likely to get lymphoma. So my life really was at stake if I didn't get over this illness. I thought maybe Dante is appearing to me in this bookstore like Virgil appeared to his fictional self in the poem. Maybe this book is a message in the bottle. Well, I didn't buy the Commedia that day because at home I have a whole shelf full of books that I bought with the best of intentions. I never got around to it. But I couldn't get Dante off my mind. A week or so later, I ordered a copy and began reading it. And I started walking with Dante through hell, up the mountain of Purgatory, and soaring through the heavens. 5 months later, I emerged at the end of the poem, exiting paradise with Dante, who has been restored. Like my fictional companion, I was spiritually healed, and because I was spiritually healed and emotionally healed, I found I was physically healed, and I was given a new vision of life. Now, I'm going to tell you the short version of how that happened. The full version is in my book, but this is not just a story about me. I would not have written a book if it was just a story about me. I'm absolutely convinced that everyone in this room can find themselves in the pages of the Commedia and find out things about themselves they didn't know was true, and find ways to new life in the pages of this book. As you'll see, the book is for all of us, and it's a personal story, but it's also unavoidably a political story. I hate the term the personal is a political, but in Dante, in surprising ways, it really is true. As most people know, the structure of the Commedia is tripartite. You've got the Inferno, the second book is Purgatorio, the third is Paradiso. The Inferno is where the pilgrim Dante goes to become reacquainted with the reality of sin. Sin in the world, and the sin that's in his own heart that has led him into the dark wood. The Purgatorio, book 2, is where Dante meets those who are bound for heaven, but whose repentance in the mortal life was imperfect. They have to be spiritually strengthened through suffering before they can be ready to bear the intensity of God's glory. The Paradiso, book 3, is where the saints live in complete unity with God and in eternal bliss. It gives us a vision of what to look forward to and what our life here on earth would be like if we were all living as we ought. Think of it in a biblical way, with reference to the Exodus narrative. The Inferno, that's slavery in Egypt. The Purgatorio is the wandering in the desert to purge the community and the individual of the ways of Egyptian slavery. The Paradiso, of course, is the Promised Land. If most people have read anything at all in the Commedia, they've read the Inferno. This is really too bad if you stop right there, because you can't really understand the meaning of the Inferno without the hope and the joy and the redemption of the books that follow. It would be like the Exodus story that ended with the Hebrews staying in slavery in Egypt. That's not the story. So if you've only read Inferno, you've only got a part of the story. I'd always thought of the Inferno as being nothing more than a grotesque catalog of medieval tortures. You know, fine, if you like that sort of thing, it's not for me. I had it completely wrong. True, it's pretty lurid and it's pretty graphic in parts, but none of this is gratuitous. The poet Dante is trying to make his readers understand what sin is, what sin does, how it deforms the human person and the community. And he does that by giving the damned souls punishments that precisely fit their crimes. In the Inferno, all sin, it's not the breaking of rules, it's the deformation of love. It's a failure of love. Either we love the wrong things, or we love the right things in the wrong way, either too much or too little. Every damned soul that's in hell is damned because they loved something more, one of their passions, more than they loved Almighty God. Ultimately, they loved themselves more than God, and they would not have God, so God gives them what they chose for eternity. They become their full selves in the afterlife. They chose to let their sins define them, and so they are defined forever by their sin. The first major sinner he encounters, and this is where the Inferno set a second hook in me, is one of the most memorable. It's Francesca da Rimini. She was a real person who was murdered by her husband when he caught her having an affair with his brother. The brother was also killed. When Dante and Virgil meet her, they're in the circle of the Inferno where the lustful are punished. And they're punished by being blown around in a cloud, a storm cloud, for eternity, to mimic passion, what lustful passion does to the soul. But the two are bound together like Siamese twins for eternity. That's their punishment. And they come over to talk to Dante, and Dante says, "Tell us how you got here." So Francesca starts telling this story that's so self-indulgent, so self-pitying. It's always somebody else's fault. Well, she and Paolo, her lover, had been reading a romance one day, and one thing led to another, and they kissed, and now here they are in hell. But she does it in such flowery language. You can tell she really believes this. What happened to her, like with all the damned, it's always somebody else's fault. She couldn't help herself. Well, Dante faints when he hears her story. Why does he faint? It could be that he knows he's guilty of lust himself. As a younger man, Dante had chased women a lot, and he wrote beautiful love poetry, hymns to the figure he called Lord Love. That was the style of the time, the troubadour style, to praise romantic love for its own sake, praise the love of romance as a form of salvation. Dante participated in that, and perhaps he saw in Francesca's fate what would be his own fate. It also could be the case that he realized and was shocked by his implication in Francesca's damnation, because when she starts quoting the books and the lines that she read that led her to fall into this adulterous affair, she quotes back some of Dante's own lines to him. So he's not guilty exactly of what happened to her. She chose her path, but he is implicated in her fate because of the poetry he wrote praising Lord Love. Now that last point is an interesting one. As you go further into the Commedia, you really do see that no man is an island. We are all part of each other. We're not all responsible for each other's sins, but we are all implicated. Sins may be individual, but they almost always have social consequences. Now, lust and the idolatry of romantic love is not something I struggle with anymore, but I very much did struggle with that as an older teenager and as an unmarried man in my 20s. I recognized my former self in Dante's portrait of Francesca. It startled me, frankly, to see how deftly Dante had sketched a portrait of me in this portrait of a real-life woman of his time. It made me realize that the poet, the man who wrote this poem, he understands something profound about human psychology. So I kept going, more and more intrigued by what I was going to find. For me, the personal turning point in my story came further down the pit in the circle of the heretics. It's complicated to say why exactly they were there, but let's just say that the section that Dante and Virgil are walking through is where the Epicureans are. These are people in his time who didn't believe in life after death. That's why they were damned. They thought that this world was all there was. We may as well get as much pleasure and glory as we can out of it because there's no afterlife. Well, they get to the afterlife and find there is an afterlife, and they spend the rest of their days living in open tombs with flames coming out of the tombs. As Dante is walking by, out of one of these tombs rises this boastful man. His name is Farinata, and he was a Ghibelline warlord back in the day. He had been one of the big combatants in the Guelph versus Ghibelline fighting in and around Florence, and had been himself a great man of the city. He was a patriot. He loved his family. He loved his status, and he was very, very, very proud of who he was. When he hears a fellow Tuscan walking by, he rises up out of the tomb and says, Who's that going by? I recognize your voice. Let me see if you're good enough to talk to. So even in death, he maintains that pride. So he and Dante start talking, and he figures out that Dante was a Guelph and he is a Ghibelline, so they start trash talking each other about life back in Florence. Who was greater? And I was reading this thinking, this is so absurd. He's dead. None of this matters anymore, but he's talking about it as if it still meant anything. But Dante the Pilgrim, who has the power to walk on, is stuck there arguing with him. And it suddenly occurred to me, this is me and my dad. My dad is the Farinata of the Bayou, and I'm like Dante, stuck there arguing with him. My dad had watched his daughter die. His own body was breaking down from old age. All the things he had built up in life were crumbling, and yet he was so proud of what he had done that he could not recognize that everything had changed and that he needed to welcome his son back so the family could continue. He was going to stick by his principles no matter what. And I realized that I myself was falling into the same trap that he was falling into by standing there and symbolically arguing with him over and over and over. My dad, I didn't have the power to make my dad walk on, but I had the power to turn myself and walk on, and I chose to. I went to see my priest after I read that, and I said, I realize that I have made an idol of family, and I have made an idol of place. Family and place are good things, can be good things, but they can be evil things when you make them the ultimate good. They are partial goods, not the ultimate good. I had given them in my heart the place that belonged to God alone and worshiped them and made my entire sense of self-worth dependent on being accepted by my family in this place and living in harmony with them. I realized I couldn't make that happen. But I had to throw down those idols. I did it in a ritual confession, as is the Orthodox tradition. But I made an affirmative decision that I'm going to walk on. I'm going to worship God and not these idols of family and place. When I did that, the floodgates of grace opened up, and things began to change within me. Well, there were other sinners on the course of the journey through the Inferno in whom I saw myself. Brunetto Latini, for one, he was one of Dante's mentors. Dante looked up to him. He was a great scholar and a public intellectual in Florence, but there he is in hell. And he sees Dante, and he knows that Dante has found a little fame back in the world, and Brunetto says, "Oh, my son, I'm so proud of you." And Brunetto's seeing his own glory represented in Dante's fame, and he says, "Son, follow your own star, and surely, you can't fail to reach a port of glory." Well, the Pilgrim doesn't yet know that this is false counsel, that this guy's in hell. Don't follow his advice. But it sounds good. It sounds like follow your bliss, follow your own star. Well, what Dante the Pilgrim eventually learns is that when you write for fame, which is what Brunetto wants him to do, to use his God-given talent to be famous and to please the masses, you buy your own damnation in that way. You betray your talent. And I saw in Brunetto, I thought about when I was a film critic at the New York Post, how I would say cruel, biting things in my reviews about movies just to make my readers laugh and just to be the wittiest guy on the block. The movies might have been bad. They were often awful, but they were made by real people, and real people were involved in it. And I had to repent of that cruelty that I had, that I exercised only to get famous. Later on, Dante sees Ulysses, the great explorer, and he is in one of the far pits of hell because he's a false counselor. He led his crew to their own death by enticing them to take risks that they shouldn't have taken and to leave their families behind and go with him to the ends of the earth to explore. He made it seem like it was virtue, but it wasn't virtue. It was sophistry, and it was self-serving. So he's damned as a false counselor. I thought about all the times I had lied to myself about the things that I wanted to do, calling them noble, but really I was trying to serve myself. As I read Dante, it was like walking through a house of mirrors. I saw parts of myself in almost every one of these sinners. And by the time I got to the very end, I was wrung out. I knew that it was time for me to change. The worst sinners in the Inferno are those who have sinned against the intellect, meaning they're guilty of sins like fraud and treason, because they sin against the part of us that is most like God. The least bad sinners, and they're all in hell, but the least bad sinners are those who sin against the body, the lustful, the gluttonous. But those who sin against the intellect have really violated the core of who man is at a much deeper level. The worst sinners are the traitors, because they make public life impossible. In Dante's day, they had to worry all the time in these cities that there was going to be a traitor in their midst who would open the city gates and let the enemies in. So people who wouldn't keep their word were considered the worst sinners to Dante. So you see the social dimension of sin. So in the pit of hell, there is Satan, the embodiment of pride, the supreme egoist. All pride leads to hell. Every single person in hell is there solo, is there of his or her own ego. So climbing out of hell, Dante and Virgil land on the shores of the mountain of Purgatory. All those who dwell in Purgatory are bound for heaven because they at some point asked God for mercy and turned from their sins, even in their dying breath. Dante, the pilgrim Dante, learns when he begins to climb the mountain that there can be no spiritual progress without humility. As he climbs each level, each terrace of the mountain, Dante sees a huge contrast to the spitefulness and egoism of the Inferno. He sees here on Purgatorio the beginnings of real community. People are happy to see each other. They're all suffering, but they're helping each other bear their burdens. The point of that purgatorial journey is to reconnect with God and reconnect with our community, to get over ourselves, to purify and reorder our loves through asceticism. The penitents suffer temporarily in the purgatory for their sins on earth, but they suffer in joy because they know that their pain is purifying them and making them ready for God. You don't have to believe in purgatory to understand what's going on in Purgatorio. It's a mirror of our life on earth as we struggle against our passions, struggle to put them behind us and to reorder our loves toward God and serving others. For me, the Terrace of Wrath was the big turning point in Purgatorio. On the Terrace of Wrath, those who are guilty of the sin of anger, right, it's being purged away from them there. There's a black cloud, a hot cloud of smoke and biting cinders on this terrace. And it really spoke to me because I was consumed with anger at my family for the injustice with which they had greeted me when I came back, what I considered to be injustice. And I couldn't control my anger. It kept me so wound up and sick. So on this level of the Purgatory, Dante meets Marco the Lombard and says to him, what is wrong with the world? Why is the world in such a terrible spot? Why is there so much violence and hatred and enmity? And this is what Dante, the poet, writes. First he, Marco, heaved a heavy sigh, which was wrung to a groan, and then began, Brother, the world is blind, and indeed you come from it. The world is blind, and indeed you come from it. You're all blind. You too, Dante. You have free will, he goes on to say, and if you exercise it to welcome the grace of God to help you overcome your passions and temper your loves by exercising that will, opening yourself to grace, you will triumph. And here's Marco again. Therefore, if the world around you goes astray, in you is the cause, and in you let it be sought. Wow. That hit me so hard. The first day I went to therapy, my therapist had said to me, I'm going to teach you that you can't change your family, but you can change your reaction to it. You can change your own heart. And I thought, okay, that'll be good if we can get there. I didn't think we could. There I was on the Terrace of Wrath on the Purgatorio, walking with Dante. Brother, I got it. I knew that I had to purge this anger from my heart if I was ever going to get better. I went right back to confession. And I told Father Matthew, he said, why are you so angry? I said, because I want justice. He said, what does love have to do with justice? And then I realized he's on to something. And I confessed my anger and made a conscious decision to put it aside and to try to seek to live in love with my dad and mom, even though it was hard. I couldn't fix my family, but I could control my reaction to them. And maybe in that way, over time, things would get better. I thought of St. Seraphim of Sarov. He said, a famous quote of his, acquire the Holy Spirit and thousands around you will be saved. I said, well, what do I have to lose? This can't go on like it is. Part 3 of the Commedia is Paradiso, which shows us life in which everyone is perfected and living in harmony with God and others. There's an important lesson I learned there too. Dante meets Picarda, a nun, who teaches Dante that the point of life is not for everybody to be equal, but to live in harmony, even if there appears to be injustice, what looks to us like injustice, because we don't know the ways of God. Picarda says to him, in his will is our peace. And I thought, I really do believe God brought me back here to serve my family. They're not letting it happen like I want them to, but maybe God has a plan here. It sounds like a cliche, but again, reading it in Dante, that art really got to me and caused me to reorder my heart. The way of perfection is to serve God and others, not myself. Eventually, Dante reaches the end of the poem. He gets to the New Jerusalem, the perfect city, where everybody loves each other without reservation and loves God and dwells in peace forever and ever. This is in contrast to Florence, the Florence from which he left. This is what we all have to look forward to, but this is a place, crucially, that can only exist in heaven, not on earth. And this is part of Dante's message that I took to heart. If you expect perfection on earth, you're going to be disappointed, and you can ruin yourself trying to realize it. I expected perfection from my family. I expected perfection from this place I moved back to. They were not capable of giving it to me. As a younger man, I expected perfection from the Catholic Church. I had been a Catholic for 13 years before I lost my faith in writing about the abuse scandal. And it wasn't like one day I woke up and it was gone. It was like it was torn out of me. I realized only too late that if I had been praying and if I'd gotten out of my head and not been reading books, but instead been working in the soup kitchen or saying my prayers, things might have been different for me. It was a lesson I was determined not to be lost on me as an Orthodox Christian, never to expect perfection from the church. That's not to say we should put up with injustice in the church, in the state, in the family at all, but we have to learn to bear it because God is the only perfection. God is the only being, only state of existence in relationship with God that can give us what our hearts really desire. I learned from reading Dante there's a difference between icons and idols. In Dante, the world is an icon. Other people are icons through which the glory of God is mediated, some more than in others. But when we make other people an idol, our girlfriends, our husbands, our wives, when we make the church an idol, when we make politics an idol, or our jobs, or our families, we err. We get off the straight path. We to keep them as icons. They are only good insofar as they are ordered by God. That was a profound lesson for me. So let me tell you something that happened. I tell this story in my book, but let me tell you something that happened after the book that really shows the wisdom of Dante, what Dante could bring. My dad and he's very old, and I help him. I take him to the hospital. I take care of his medications every week, week in and week out. The day before Good Friday, Western Good Friday, I took him to get his hair cut, and he was talking to me on the way home saying that death is coming soon. He knows that for him. And I asked him if he was ready spiritually, if he had squared everything with God. He said, well, I think I have. I said, have you repented of all your sins? He said, well, I don't have anything to repent of. I said, really? So we started talking, and finally I said, all right, Daddy, I have forgiven you for this. I love you. If I didn't love you, if I hadn't forgiven you, I wouldn't be here now. But you and I have a lot of history here. And we talked about that in a very gentle way, and he just didn't get it. And I thought, well, I guess I'll never get to have that reconciliation with him. So I went home. The next day I came over on Good Friday to fill his pillbox for him. And he was sitting on his front porch in the rocking chair reading the newspaper with his walker in front of him. And I kissed him good morning, and I went in and filled his meds, and I was leaving because I had a lot of work to do that day. And when I came out of the house, he took me by the arm and looked at me very tenderly and said, I don't know what I would do without you. And I said, well, thank you for saying that. That really means a lot to me. And I started to walk away. He pulled me down, and his eyes were filling with tears, and his chin was quivering. And he said, I want to tell you, the Lord and I had a long talk last night. This is an old country man. So a long talk last night. And I told him about all my transgressions against you. And I told him I was sorry. And I think he heard me. And I just looked at him and I thought, this is Lord Marchmain on his deathbed making the sign of the cross. My dad is a proud Southern patriarch, and he can't actually say, son, I'm sorry, but he did the best he could, and it was good enough. And I gave thanks to God for that, and I kissed him on the cheek and told him goodbye and went home. And I realized on the way home that if I had not read Dante, if I had not listened to Father Matthew and let love be the thing that guided me and not justice, we never would have had that conversation. If I hadn't done as Dante advised and Dante showed and kept serving him in love instead of insisting on justice, even though I thought I deserved justice, we wouldn't have had that reconciliation. And even more broadly, if I had not gone home down there and fallen into a dark wood, the deep healing between me and my dad that I wanted all my life would never have happened. I say this to advise you the same as I advised Hannah on the street in Paris that night. Don't run from pain, don't run from suffering, but treat it as an opportunity to grow in love. We are not meant simply to bear our pain. We're meant to allow it to transform us, to die to ourselves so new life can come within us. This is what humility does. Pride can't stand that. Humility demands it. I'll conclude by talking about the role of art in our transformation. I have to tell you that most everything I learned from Dante, I already knew at some level from years of reading philosophy and theology and arguing online and online polemics and apologetics. It took for me encountering it in great art for it to destroy these truths, to destroy all the intellectual defenses I had built up against them. As I said, when I went to see the therapist, I was very skeptical about it. I didn't want to listen to anything he had to say. I had already had my ironic quip ready for any bit of cheesy Dr. Phil stuff he threw at me. Well, he didn't do that. That was my prejudice. But I found that I would go sit down with him week after week and say, I was reading Dante this week, and this is what I learned about myself. And we would use Dante as a jumping off point to talk about, from a therapeutic point of view, what was going on within me and within my family. I would take Dante into the confessional with my priest, not literally, and it was a Russian Orthodox priest is going to be really skittish about Dante. But Father Matthew saw, and he told me this, he said, I can see this is working on you. It was a guide to confession for me. The Divine Comedy, that journey took me so deep in my heart, and the role of art and beauty was what made all the difference. I remember when I was 17 years old and knew everything there was to know about life. I knew enough to realize that Christianity couldn't possibly be true. It was for weaklings and simpletons. My mom won a trip to Europe in a church raffle and sent me because she knew I always wanted to go to Europe. So I went off at 17. I was on a tour bus with a bunch of old people. Couldn't wait to get to Paris so I could go look at girls and maybe get some wine. And 17 years old. But we stopped on the way into Paris, and about an hour outside the city at this big cathedral. And I thought, all right, I may as well go in. I have nothing to lose here. And of course, this is the cathedral at Chartres. I walked in there as a callow 17-year-old, and I saw God. I didn't see an apparition. I saw beauty that was so complex, so overwhelming. I had no category for it. I was overwhelmed by it. I did not walk out of that cathedral as a Christian, but I walked out of there on a quest. Something had happened. I was on to something, as Walker Percy would put it. And that eventually led me into the Catholic Church and to becoming a Christian as an adult. Well, it led me out of that crisis of faith and into a mature adult faith. 30 years later, I walked into another cathedral unexpectedly, this cathedral in verse, this medieval cathedral in verse that is the Commedia. And it cracked my cynicism, it cracked my hard heart, and it brought me new life. Pope Benedict XVI said that the best arguments the church has for itself are the art it produces and its saints. Dante created supreme art in which he profiled sinners, and great saints, and everyone in between. They felt so real. When I was researching my book, I found neuroscientists have discovered now that when subjects are presented with certain propositional truths in the form of a nonfiction essay, and then they're presented the same truths in the form of narrative fiction, their brains light up in much different ways when they read it in fiction as opposed to nonfiction. In fact, when you're reading about someone walking, for example, and you're reading about it in a story, your brain, the part of your brain that lights up when you walk, also lights up. So in a real way, art and fiction incarnate these propositions. Those principles and doctrines that helped me change my life came alive in art. I knew what to do because I saw myself, my worst self and my best self, in these characters Dante created. I saw that I was the author of so many of my own sufferings. I saw that I did not have the power to overcome them on my own, but I did have the power to admit that I was powerless and open myself to the grace of God, as Dante Alighieri had done, and as he told his story in the form of poetry. This is true for all of us, and who knows what kind of healing and wholeness and harmony awaits all of us if we go on this journey individually and together. Dante believed, as did Aristotle, that we only know ourselves truly through knowing each other. And Dante says we only know each other truly by knowing each other through God, first through God. Reality is relational. I know that now. In Dante, we can see a vision of the beloved community that we can create together if we struggle together against our passions and bear one another's burdens in love. Finally, I have to remind you, I come here as a witness, not a scholar. But one of the greatest literary scholars of the 20th century, Erich Auerbach, in his unforgettable book about Dante, says the Commedia depends on the power of witness to work its magic. You have to believe that in some way, Dante Alighieri, in his poem, bears witness to the truth, a truth that is impossible to fully apprehend with the intellect, but is there and is graspable through the heart. Giuseppe Mazzotta, one of the leading Dante scholars today, teaches at Yale, says that in the end, even though the Commedia is one of the great products of intellect and of scholasticism, in the end, you get down to the bottom of it and you realize it's all about conversion of the heart. It's the heart or it's nothing. The power is there in that poem. The truth is in there. The call to conversion is in there. I never really understood what Dostoevsky meant in that oft-quoted line, "Beauty will save the world," until I read Dante. If the world will be saved, it's because the splendor of truth comes to us incarnate, sensual creatures in great beauty that is allied to truth. I can think of no work of art more beautiful and more truthful than the Divine Comedy of Dante Alighieri, and I'm privileged to bear witness to its power to save my life and to save our lives. Thank you very much.